I've been working on this project for months now, and I'm so excited to share it with you. It spans several disciplines from sculpting to building aquariums and plants. More on that as we get into this, but enough talk. Let's get to work. I'll begin by creating the face with pottery clay. I built it up onto this board here to achieve the appropriate shape. Once I did, I made a few marks to indicate where the features will go. I carved along these accordingly. At first, I liked the results, but I quickly became dissatisfied. So I pulled all of the clay off the board and started over. This time, I tried carving it out of foam. I wanted the face to have a lot of angular features, and I thought it would be easier to pull that off with foam. This was promising at first, but again, I didn't care for the progress. I went back to the clay, and as they say, the third time's a charm. I followed the same process as before, but I shaped things a little differently. As I did, my goal was to take a stylized approach. In doing so, I took a lot of inspiration from the Easter Island Moai statues. I wanted something that looked human, but with as little detail as possible. My thought was if it looks too human, it will likely appear creepy, which is not what I'm trying to do here. Anyway, I went around and carefully carved everything as desired. As it came together, I addressed the mouth. I want the face to spit water from here, so I was mindful of how I created this. I went back and smoothed out the surface of the clay. I also scraped excess off the board to clean things up. Here's the result. I think it looks pretty cool and will make for an awesome design. As is, clay won't work for a tank, so I'll cast a mold of this using viable materials. To make it happen, I chopped up 2x4s and locked them together with screws. This fit perfectly around the face like so. I wanted this to look like a statue that's been reclaimed by nature. I felt that cracks and other features would help portray that. So I went on to make a few cracks, scuffed the surface with a wire brush, and created dents with stones. I like how it looked before, but I think this distressed appearance will better create the look I'm imagining. I also ran some hot glue along the edges to seal everything off. I'll fill this form with a silicone mold to create a negative of the face. It consists of two separate components that when combined together will cure to pick up the detail from my carving. I poured them into a different bucket and mixed them together until consistent. Then I placed the mixture into a vacuum chamber to remove air bubbles. For the best results, it's optimal to pour this into a single spot from high up. That way the material levels itself without introducing air bubbles. I let this sit for 24 hours so the silicone could cure. After that came time to release the mold. I flipped it over and removed the screws. Then I used a chisel and putty knife to separate the pieces. I carefully peeled the silicone from the clay to reveal a direct negative of the sculpture. This will be used later on, but there's more I need to make. I also wanted to include some hands under the face. I built up clay around a few boards that will help support the structure. As I did, I created two outstretched hands. Like the face, I didn't want an excessive amount of detail, just enough to get the point across. I distressed these just like I did before. Here's the result. I think they look cool, but again, I need to create a mold. I secured a wooden box around them accordingly. Then I mixed up some more silicone. I poured it in like before, but I only filled in half of the form. I also placed two dowels near the top. I removed these from the mold after it cured to create two holes. More on those later. After that, I filled in the second half of the form and let the silicone cure. After all of that, I was able to separate everything and reveal the mold. I had an issue though. I failed to apply a release agent between the layers, which made them bond together and negate some of what I did earlier. I just cut through the pieces instead and removed the clay. Finally, I sprayed off the molds to remove any residual clay. The result is a 2-section mold for the hands and another for the face. Now that I have these, I'll cast the pieces with an aquarium safe urethane resin. It's easy to use, but I need to experiment first. I mixed up a batch to cast for a control to see how it looks on its own. For another, I pressed sand and other materials onto the sides of the mold to embed it into the outside of the resin. I mixed these materials into the resin itself for a final option. I let it cure and pulled them from the form. Based on what I see here, I think the second mixing technique will work best for what I want to do. Now I can cast the pieces. I sprayed some water in the face mold. This allowed sand and other materials to stick to the sides. I repeated this for the hands. As I did, I had to ensure that none of this remained where the silicone lines up. I pressed them together and locked them in with some tape. That said, I had to put foam on the sides because the tape won't stick to the silicone. You'll see here that I also taped a bag around all of it to ensure that nothing leaked out. Now then, let's cast the pieces. I measured out the resin parts and mixed them together. Then I poured the mix into the molds and let it cure. Luckily, that doesn't take very long. After waiting, I anxiously deformed the pieces because I couldn't wait to see how they turned out. There was some spillover from expansion, so I had to clean up the pieces. I cut off as much as I could and addressed the rest on a belt sander. I'm ecstatic with how these turned out. They look exactly like what I carved before and appear as weathered stone or concrete, which is exactly what I wanted. As I said earlier, I also custom built this tank that will house everything. To build it, I followed the same process as usual. I cut out glass to the appropriate sizes, sanded the edges with wet sandpaper, taped it all up, and assembled everything with silicone. I applied more to the inside, smoothed it out, and removed the tape. After it cured, I was able to adjust the details for the sculptures. I set the face and hands on a separate piece of glass for reference. Then I marked for the mouth so I could determine where to drill a hole. I traced the outline of a diamond-tipped hole saw for reference. From there I built up a ring of clay around the marking to create a reservoir of water. I drilled through this and continued onward. I placed a foam board on the back of the tank to properly align the glass. I applied silicone along the edges to lock it in and let it cure. After a little bit of work, the tank was ready to go. I double checked to make sure all the pieces still fit. As expected they did, so I went on to apply silicone to the back of each piece and set them on the glass. After all of that, the tank looked like this. I'm very pleased with the result because it took a lot of work to get here. We gotta bring the jungle to this design though. To create the background, I decided to keep it simple with some tree fern panels. I placed these in the tank and removed bits so they fit perfectly around the face. I applied silicone to their backs and secured them. Since this is comprised of multiple panels, I had to blend them together. Simple enough. I applied black silicone along the cracks and pressed tree fern debris into it. This all made for a cohesive look. Driftwood will tie into this as well. I have 2 pieces of manzanita driftwood to start. I oriented them so that they wrap around the face. Once I liked the placement, I secured them with super glue. In addition to these, I have a few branches of jungle wood. I wove and glued these within the other branches. Although simple, I really like how this looks. I'll do more shortly, but I want to install the pump and do a water test first. I'll create a barrier for the pump so that it won't intake debris. I put a piece of fine metallomat on the bottom to filter out substrate and other large particles. Then I placed a fine filter sponge on top of this to keep all of the fine particles out. As for the pump itself, I have a seed chain micra, a modified return piece, and a vinyl tube. I combined these together and hooked it up to the back side of the face's mouth. Let's see how it works. This is very close to how I imagined it would look, and I absolutely love it. With that addressed, it's ready for plants. First, I want to cover the branches with Java moss. To keep it properly hydrated, I'll utilize cargo mesh, which will wick moisture above the water line. I attached it to the appropriate areas with zip ties. As for the moss, I'll use fishing line. No, we won't be catching any fish with it, but if I could catch a like and a subscribe, that would be pretty cool. Anyway, I wrapped this around the moss to keep it secure until it naturally attaches to the surfaces. It was a lot of work, but well worth the effort. Plus, the combination of cargo fabric and moss will make it easier to add to other plants. I began by nestling rabbit's foot ferns in areas where the roots are hydrated by the moss. These will add a lot of texture and grow well in this environment. A few Neoregelia bromeliads seemed like a great addition to add to the jungle vibe. I also included a Photonia red vein for a pop of color. I glued Tillandsia ionantha throughout for texture. Lastly, I added a few Cryptanthus nubicola. The result is a densely planted jungle that contrasts with the face. Before I move down to the water feature, I'll include biological filter media. I put all of this into a filter bag and dropped it in the back of the tank. After that, I moved it over to the shelf and hooked it up to an LED aquarium light. I also added a simple scape to the bottom. I went with a few black lava rocks. As for the substrate, I mixed up black sand, black gravel, and aqua soil. The combination blends well with the lava rocks and retains the dark, mysterious jungle I'm trying to create. After adjusting all of that, I could fill it back up and add various aquatic plants. I began with the largest plant in this area, a dwarf aquarium lily. Once I got that secure, I added a few stems of Pogostem installaris octopus. I really like the fine textures on these. Then I filled in the left section with Hygrophila corymbosa. Lastly, I filled in the midground and some of the foreground with Cryptocorini lutea. After all of that, I went back above the rim and added some Java moss around the hands. I topped off the water feature with Salvinia minima. That more or less completes the design aspect of this tank. All I have to do now is introduce the inhabitants and enjoy the finished product. I'm keeping it light with a few zebra nerite snails and endlers. Introducing the complete Forgotten Forest reclaimed Paludarium. As I said in the beginning, a lot of work went into this project and I couldn't be happier with how it all turned out. My vision was very specific, and although there are things I would have done differently if I had more time, I think the result is awesome. My vision was to create a statue or ruins that have been overtaken by nature. Erosion and flooding has caused the statue to almost be completely submerged in water, but what remains has created a waterfall. Nature has nearly reclaimed this section of the jungle, and the wildlife is happy to call this home. As usual, I think the piece speaks for itself, and it's one that I'm very excited to finally share with you. For now though, that's where this journey's gonna end. As always, I really hope you all enjoyed the video and learned something new. Until next time, Serpa Squad, take care and peace.